Hi there, thank you everybody. Alex, can we have a photo? Okay. Now, my eyes were first opened to just how badly people in preceding generations behaved when I was 13 years old. You know, older people, well, they were older, you know, they didn't do bad things. But one rainy afternoon in November 1982, I was completely educated by an article in the Sunday Times. It was in the review section of the Sunday Times, and it was headed, "Aristocrats, Alcohol and Adultery." It was the first of a series of extracts from a book called White Mischief by James Fox, which told the story of the unsolved murder of the Earl of Errol in Kenya in 1941. And this first extract covered the story of Idina, who was Errol's first wife. Here she is. Idina was Errol's first wife, but he was her third husband. And she was 30 when they married, and he was 22. She was 5'3". She went everywhere barefoot. She was not conventionally beautiful, but she was irresistible to men and could whistle a chap off a branch. She had lovers without number. And what's more, she wanted her friends to have them too. When you went round to Idina's house, the article said, and her house was this farmhouse high up in the Kenyan hills, so it took ages to get there and you had to stay the night. When you went to Idina's house, you would arrive and the evening would begin in her bathroom, where she would still be in the bath. And there you would be served cocktails and the chat would continue. There'd be more cocktails. Eventually she'd get out of the bath, dry herself, get dressed, and then there'd be more cocktails, and then she'd produce a sort of 4-course French meal, and which she'd produce not obviously by herself, but by persuading a French cook to come and live, or somebody she could teach how to cook to come and live up in Kenya with her. And after dinner, the games began. And this was a means by which Idina would determine who was going to spend the night with whom, regardless of who they were married to or who they'd come with. One of the games involved an allocation of room keys for the night. Another one involved stretching a sheet between everyone and blowing a feather across to see who was going to end up with whom. And I thought, you know, this was extraordinary. I was completely gobsmacked, but not nearly as gobsmacked as I was 5 minutes later, when my mother told me that Idina was her grandmother. I was, of course, fascinated, and I remained fascinated, and a few years ago I could no longer resist the fascination and decided to piece together her story, which I put together in a book called The Bolter. And one of the things that was fascinating was how, you know, Idina's set of friends became known as the Happy Valley set, this little sort of group, and she was regarded as the high priestess. But, you know, how did people suddenly start behaving like this in the 1920s? Well, it wasn't out of the blue, because Idina had grown up in the Edwardian age, and her friend said, and the Edwardian age, adultery was literally institutionalized amongst the tops of society. And there was a group called the Marlborough House set who all hung around Edward VII, and particularly they started hanging around him when he was Prince of Wales, and his mother lived forever, so he was Prince of Wales forever, and he didn't have anything to do apart from sleep with other men's wives, and so this is what he did. And so all his friends around became acceptable behavior. And the Marlborough House rules were the following. First of all, discretion. As the actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell said, you can do what you like in the bedroom, as long as you don't do it in the street and frighten the horses. Secondly, if you were a woman, you had to be married to join in. Now, you only actually chose lovers from amongst your same little social group, your friends, husbands and wives. You know, it was fine if you were all friends. And you had to be married, and this meant that if there were any children came out of the relationship, then they were just incorporated into your marriage. And this meant that also for women, you weren't supposed to start until you'd had 2 children, preferably 2 boys, an heir and a spare. And interestingly, this is because adultery comes from the verb adulterate, which means to spoil. And what was at risk in adultery was spoiling the bloodline, the idea that a man might pass property onto a child who wasn't actually his own. So if you had 2 boys, that should, you know, if the first one died, then the second one should get it. And quite honestly, who cared who was the father of the following children? The other system as well was, I mean, these rules were really practical, as you notice. The most practical of them all was the time of day. And this was the best time for having this sort of adultery was between 5 and 7 in the afternoon. This was because women, before the First World War, still wore these incredibly complicated corsets, and they were very hard to get in and out of. And it was a bit indelicate, you know, if you wore these corsets, you were one of these ladies who had a maid, it was a bit indelicate to suddenly ring the bell and say, "Hi, my chap's come round, come and get me undressed." So what would happen is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, your lady's maid would undress you out of your tea gown, which you'd been wearing since 4 o'clock for tea, and she would leave you until she came back at 7 in order to dress you into your evening gown. And there you have it, the Sanka set. Now, how did it leap from this to sort of mass partner swapping parties? Well, the answer is the First World War. First World War, as we know, changed everything. One of the things it sort of changes people's view on life. Before the war, everyone had lived according to this strict set of social codes, and whatever those codes were, they'd led to the horror that was the First World War. Therefore, we didn't need to look at those anymore, we didn't need to think about them anymore. The other thing that started happening during the First World War is that the duty to give any soldier on home on leave a good time began to override the duty not to have sex before you got married. And, you know, I don't know how many people went all the way and risked pregnancy, but certainly a load of very heavy petting began happening a lot amongst these things. And the other thing that happened is that the men were fewer and further between. So you've got sort of unmarried women coming to the equation and fewer men, which meant that almost any man was sort of fair game, and because people were misbehaving more, apparently there's some evolutionary thing. If we think we're all about to die the next day, we all have to try and get pregnant immediately. But they, which meant that sort of unmarried, yes, married men began to become sort of fair game, and the whole thing totally loosened up. Now, in these parties in sort of early 20s, as we came out of the war, we come into the early 20s, and people started having dinner parties, and they had dinner parties, but at the end of these sort of wild parties, if you think of the flappers and going to the nightclubs, people did stunts at the end of the evening, and this was something like each taking it in turns to do something entertaining. So you would say a limerick, a poem, sing a song, and gradually these stunts got wilder and wilder. And Idina, living as she was in a very wild time by the 1920s, had a favorite trick, which was to open many bottles of champagne and pour them into a bath and leap in. This was recounted by Tallulah Bankhead, to whom she taught the trick. I mean, amazingly, Tallulah Bankhead's parents had sent Tallulah to be put in Idina's care, which, in the 1920s, which beggars belief that, I mean, social services would be around like a shot nowadays. And so, you know, Idina was living in this thing, but she was so much worse than all the other people at those times, because the end of the First War, her first marriage had fallen apart, and she'd rushed off to Kenya with a second husband and came back 2 years later only with carrying a pet of a serval cat, no husband. The serval cat, with whom she was widely photographed and sort of pictured in all the press, replaced her Pekingese, who was black and called Satan, with whom she'd been wandering about under her arm for the previous 10 years. And at this stage, because she'd been twice divorced, this was the early 1920s, she'd sunk to the depths. People, in biographies, it refers to people as having sunk to the depths because they were seen around in London and Paris with her. And we have a picture, I'm now about to show you a picture. This is what she looked like at the end of the 20s, right? I'm now going to show you a picture of her at the beginning of the 20s, but when she was already regarded as the sort of lowest form of wickedest woman as there ever was. Alex, can we have the next picture? There. Looks like an angel, doesn't she? I mean, obviously she behaved differently, but you can see how much the hard living did for her in the sort of intervening 6 years. But anyhow, sort of there you are, looked sweet, didn't behave that way. In the early 20s, so she was divorced twice, incredibly shocking. You were allowed to have one divorce after the war, but not two. And then in the early 1920s, she became engaged again. She became engaged to the man, Jos Hay, who was going to be murdered in Kenya later on. And this caused a storm. They announced their engagement in Venice. Paparazzi chased them. The photograph of them was on the next sort of weekly edition of Tatler. And they thoroughly misbehaved. And Idina this time thought she would have an open marriage. Her second husband had complained that she was an nymphomaniac, so she thought, let's go for an open marriage, plus Jos is 10 years younger than me. I'm probably not going to hang on to him. Let's do it this way. And it's modern now, you know, it's 1924. And First, Joss leapt into this open marriage quite rapidly on the boat out to Kenya, where they were going to go and live and farm. There was a story told by Idina about how he'd been in a cabin with another man's wife, and the husband had come in and almost caught the woman on her knees in front of him. She thought that was funny, but times went on. They went off to Kenya, and these wild evenings began. They had this farmhouse high in the hills, and you would arrive and you'd find on your pillow a bottle of whiskey and a pair of pajamas, if you were a man, because silk pajamas is what men wore in the evening, of course, morally dubious in those times. And these games would begin after dinner. They'd have these wild parties, and there were, various new games would begin. And this was all jolly for Idina until she became pregnant. And she then knew that Joss, her husband, might stray for longer. The idea of the open marriage was you could do what you want, and they didn't have to be so discreet about it. But what you mustn't do is let anything become serious. And this lack of discretion, by the way, was what was really shocking people at that time, because, as we said beforehand, everyone had lovers, but the thing about the 20s is nobody bothered to hide it anymore, and this is what polite society couldn't stand. So in order to keep her husband home, Idina thought what she would do was invite one of her best friends, who was also a lover of her husband's, to stay. And that way, her husband could stay at home and have an affair while she was pregnant, instead of wandering off and finding someone else and possibly getting more serious. So along came Alice de Jancy, who was this very wild American girl, and her husband, Fred de Jancy, who was obliging in these matters. And they lived in this sort of very jolly ménage à quatre, in a way. Although I rather feel that Idina and Fred simply ended up bedding together sometimes because the other two were off, so, what else were you going to do? And this all sort of seemed to be fine. Idina then started having a great affair with a very dashing cowboy called Boy Long, and it just all seemed to work. And then, however, the idyll was not to last. Oh, we've got another photo. Sorry, next photo. This is a photo of showing, Idina really was so incredibly relaxed about the relationship between Alice and Joss. She kept on saying, Alice is my best friend, and she knew that basically Alice was so loopy that Joss was never actually going to run off with her and marry her. So she was quite safe in that. But there is Idina looking rather unprepossessing in her gardening dress in the middle. And there's her husband there, and there's her best friend. All very happy and mellow in Kenya, and they liked it that way. Anyhow, it didn't last, and it didn't last because of this, the next photo, which was another fellow called Raymond de Trafford who turned up. Now, various things happened. Alice ran off with Raymond de Trafford, and she came back and was immediately dragged back to Paris by her husband, Fred. Raymond followed. His family then forbade her from marrying Alice. Alice then decided to shoot him in the stomach at point-blank range and then shoot herself at the Gare du Nord, which was a very dramatic thing to do when a relationship's not going well. Miraculously, both of them survived. Even more miraculously, Alice was acquitted on the grounds of having committed a crime passionnel and fined $4 for possessing a firearm. And yet, more miraculously, they then got married. And that is what happened. And of course, the marriage lasted 3 months. They fell apart. Alice came back to Kenya, and sort of Alice and Joss took up again. But Idina, by now, had been left by Joss. She was left by Joss, and she'd moved on to another husband. Now, rather unwisely, Idina chose for her fourth husband a man who was shotgun-wielding and very, very obsessively jealous. Given that Idina had liked misbehaving to a great deal, this was a very silly idea, and her husband, Donald Haldeman, then decided he would start shooting at anybody he thought might be her lover. This was a very, very long list, and bullets were flying around Kenya. Idina then had to resort to employing a man to beat a tom-tom drum down the drive so that it would warn her whenever her husband was coming home, which would give whoever was in her bed enough time to get out and drive away in his car at sufficient speed that he might not actually take the tires out or damage the car, because he was damaging quite a lot of cars at the time. But this was all the sort of the way in which Idina lived then. And this was how, talking about scandal in the 1920s, how the great phrase arose, the saying of the time, which was, "Are you married or do you live in Kenya?"